It's been going on for a year and a half now and getting worse by the day. The conflict in Sudan has killed thousands of people and led to one of the worst humanitarian crises in the world. Diplomacy has so far failed. So what lies ahead for Sudan and its people? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Tom McRae. The people of Sudan have been through a lot. More than a year of devastating conflict, the world's biggest humanitarian crisis, disease outbreak and displacement on a scale not seen anywhere else. Yet there is no end in sight to the conflict that has killed thousands of people. The Sudanese army has now launched a major offensive to retake the capital Khartoum and surrounding areas from the rapid support forces, while accusing the paramilitary group of receiving support from regional countries. We have a lot to get to with our guests shortly, but first, this report from Alex Beard.
After nearly 18 months of war, this is the daily scene on many streets in Sudan. The army has now launched a major offensive to retake areas in and around the capital, Khartoum. The paramilitary Rapid Support Forces has maintained its tight grip on the city since war broke out in April last year. Army Chief Abdelkhalig Shaib says the military is committed to a transition to civilian government, but insists the RSF must withdraw.
This devastating aggression is being waged by the Rapid Support Forces, with the support of states in the region providing funding and mercenaries as well as weapons to the RSF. This has resulted in the deaths of tens of thousands of Sudanese and the displacement of many millions more.
Both sides have accused foreign powers of involvement in the conflict. Sudan's army accuses the UAE of providing support to the RSF, while the leader of the paramilitary group has accused Egypt of carrying out airstrikes on its positions, claims Cairo has firmly denied.
Egypt hit us, and now, during the Geneva talks, they brought 8 Chinese aircraft with American engines. We have all the details. The bombs now hit us. Before, it was indirectly. Now, they hit directly.
And with no end in sight to the fighting, there's more suffering for Sudanese civilians. Around 20,000 people have now been killed, and more than 10 million have been forced to flee their homes, a quarter of them into neighbouring countries. Half the population is in desperate need of food and healthcare. The World Health Organization is now reporting soaring cases of cholera and says the nation's healthcare system is in free fall, with 75% of facilities in Khartoum declared non-functional. The conflict between the army and the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces began in mid-April last year after disagreement on how to integrate RSF fighters into the Sudanese army. There have been numerous attempts at peace talks, the most recent in August in Geneva. But for now, the two sides seem determined to fight on, while Sudan's people struggle to survive. Alex Beard, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. In Nairobi is Sebastien Ponsford, Humanitarian Affairs Manager for Doctors Without Borders, and has just got back from a 4-month deployment in Sudan. In Manama, Abdelkhalig Shaib is a Sudanese lawyer who advises on Sudan's constitution and politics. And in Toronto, Hala Alkarib, a Sudanese pro-democracy and African feminist activist, who's also the regional director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa. A warm welcome to each of you. Thank you very much for being with us here on Inside Story. Sebastien, if I can begin with you, since you have just returned from Port Sudan, I believe, less than a week ago. I mean, we saw a little bit of what it was like there after recent heavy fighting in the story that we've just run. Can you just give us a bit of a better idea of the realities of what it is like on the ground and the people that you encountered and what they are facing every day?
Thank you very much. Yes, the situation right now in Sudan is absolutely catastrophic. With the latest fighting in Khartoum, we've seen an uptick in the number of trauma and war-wounded patients arriving to our hospitals. In one of the hospitals we support in Omdurman, in the capital, we're seeing people arriving with shrapnel wounds, gunshot wounds, stabbing wounds. It's really catastrophic, and I think I cannot stress enough the scale and the intensity of the humanitarian situation that we're witnessing. We have hit in more than a year now the 10,000 war wounded patient mark in our facility in Khartoum. In South Darfur, the region has become a humanitarian desert. In South Darfur, where I work, where I've been working more, where I've focused more, we are seeing alarming levels of malnutrition. We are seeing 1 out of 3 kids under 2 in the localities where we have worked and screened kids for malnutrition. Being acutely malnourished, we are seeing 8% numbers of severe acute malnutrition. So kids that are really at risk of dying if no intervention at scale is deployed in the coming weeks. We are seeing amongst the worst rates of maternal mortality that MSF is seeing globally across the operations. Just to give you an idea, in just under a month, in July, we've seen 11 women dying in just one of the facilities. That's as much as women dying in a country like the Netherlands in a year. This is because, conflict dynamics, displacement, violence, the lack of humanitarian response is really limiting people's access to healthcare. As you were reporting, up to 80% of the healthcare facilities across the country are now completely collapsed.
Just so many issues facing so many people. Hala, Sebastien there mentioned the issues particularly that women are facing, and I know that your work focuses on women and girls in conflict regions. Can you just talk us through what women are facing in Sudan right now? Because there have been many accusations against both sides of atrocities that have been committed against females.
I think at this point, we cannot stress or speak more about what we have been speaking about for over 18 months, that the women and girls' conditions are beyond dire in Sudan. They have been the center of violence and atrocities in this war. Sexual violence is extremely rampant. Lack of access to sexual and reproductive health is quite significant. Very, very minimal investment on women's health, on women's access to services, on women's safety and security, and issues of protections. And particularly the investments on access to sexual and reproductive health, since the beginning of the conflict, has been extremely minimal. And this is something that we have talked about throughout the 18 months. Sudan doesn't have, until this point, we don't have specialized services that's geared to survivors of sexual violence. We don't have specialized services to pregnant women, to women who are struggling with childbirth under these difficult circumstances. And the international organizations such as the UNFPA, they are claiming to be struggling significantly with lack of funding. So despite the fact that all the international actors speaks about their commitments, towards challenging and addressing, the high prevalence of sexual violence and women access to sexual reproductive health services, on ground, we don't see much actually happening.
And it doesn't seem at this point in time like the fighting is going to be ending anytime soon either. Abdelkhalig, the army, as we mentioned, has launched recently a major offensive to try and retake the capital from the RSF. That's seen a huge uptick in violence and deaths. Do you think that the conflict will actually be won by whoever wins Khartoum? And could this potentially be the beginning of the end if the army can retake the capital?
I think we need to look at it. What does it mean for the South Sudanese armed forces regaining regaining control of wide areas in the between the capital, which is Khartoum, and then the Al Jazeera state? I think what it means is it will give them leverage. It will mean that they're tipping the scale in their favor. which is, gaining control of areas that, that previously has been under the rapid support forces. But this could also give them the chance to shape any other any other agreements, post-conflict agreements. I think if you look at, the ground offensive operation, which is supported by air and even naval forces, it could tell you that there is no negotiation at the now with the RSF before they regain control of these areas, and they're getting closer to that. What will it mean is basically would help them reach a ceasefire that favors the narrative that the Sudanese armed forces is basically advocating for, and it also would help as well put the terms that they could agree to, how to end the conflict. But does it mean that the end of the conflict? I don't think it means the end of the conflict. I think it would be very difficult to end the conflict with a definitive military solution. But that military offensive and the operations would help you definitely in the negotiating an agreement. So it gives them the leverage that they need. It would add more pressure on the RSF. It would give them as well international support, which is now looking at both parties that they are both equal, and this is a fight between Burhan and Hemeti, and it's I think it's oversimplification of a bit naive to think this way. So that would change the narrative international region as well.
Yeah, We'll get to the ceasefire negotiations and potential to actually how this comes to an end a little bit more in a moment. But Sebastien, can you just give us an idea of what it's like in some of these displacement camps where, hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to move to, and some of the stories from the people that you met there, and just how difficult it is to try and get aid and help to them?
Absolutely. The situation in the IDP camps is disastrous. I mean, there's barely any access to water and sanitation, for example, which is leading to waves of, for example, cholera. We are seeing a tremendous number of outbreaks of measles, cholera. MSF is responding in Gadaref state, in Kassala state, setting up emergency cholera treatment units, and people are just dying of, very preventable and easily treatable disease just because they don't have access to healthcare. In the IDP camps, what we see as well, for example, especially as we were discussing the situation of women, we see women, for example, not being able to access emergency care because, for example, of the risk of sexual violence or generalized insecurity across the country. In one of the maternities where we work in South Darfur, we had relatives of a patient, of a woman who unfortunately died just as she arrived to the hospital, telling us that she was pregnant, she had complications. She tried to reach a primary healthcare center that was unfortunately closed. She went to another one. The lack of essential drugs there meant that they could not treat her. So she returned to the IDP setting, waited to collect money from the community to be able to go to the hospital. This took a couple of days. The complications kicked in, and then there was no referral pathway for her. So she had to take a tuk-tuk with the community. And by the time she got to the hospital, she was already in sepsis. It was too late, and she was dying. This is one of the tens of stories that we continue to hear from my patients. I think so. Yeah, the lack of access to care, and people are not able, for example, to buy their chronic medication, for example. So people suffering from diabetes, from all of these complications that are easily preventable, are today just becoming widespread across the country. One of the key things we're trying also to support our patients with is the mental health impact and wounds that the conflict is having on the population. It's specifically impacting kids, for example. We had parents telling us that their kids are traumatized by the sound of airplanes or cars moving around, as especially the ones who were displaced from areas of conflict like Khartoum. So yeah, the conflict displacement is taking a real toll on the civilian population in Khartoum, and it's really time to scale up the response and act now to be able to save and alleviate the needs of the civilian population in Sudan.
Hala, you touched on that a little bit earlier about the international response, and while people are willing to speak up and talk, their actions don't necessarily match their words. I mean, who at this point is actually willing to protect the millions of people that have been trapped in the middle of this conflict? Not just to talk about it, but to actually do something?
Well, this is a good question. You know, we have been talking about this situation and warning against it as activists, as grassroots organization from the beginning, since the beginning of the armed conflict, that this is a very serious, war, and it will have significant ramifications on more than 4 million people across Sudan. And whatever we have been saying, it has not been taken seriously. I'm talking about the donors community, and I'm talking about their commitments.
Why is that? Why aren't people taking it seriously?
I think Sudan is not being dealt with as a priority country. Humanitarian aid and humanitarian assistance is processed to other countries in crisis, despite being in conflict, and there is wars that's happening. But in the case of Sudan, there have not been a significant investment on protection strategy and on channeling humanitarian aid strategies to the communities and to the Sudanese people. This war that Sudanese people are not party of. They are not part of it, and it's primarily a war where Sudanese people's bodies have been used as shields. In this conflict. So it's extremely unfortunate that the claims about enabling humanitarian aids by international donors and actors from the international community, it's not real. It's not true. Most of the humanitarian aid, for example, that was supposed to enter into North Darfur, into an area that struggle with extreme devastations like Al-Fashir. It didn't get there. And still, the international community is not exerting enough pressure on the belligerents in terms of securing, humanitarian aid and making sure that it reach to the population in needs. That is not happening.
Yeah. Abdelkhalig, do you agree with that sentiment? But basically, because much has been made of the lack of international attention on Sudan, can you just give us an idea of why you think that might be? Is it because it's simply a poor country in Africa, and there have been two other major conflicts in Ukraine and the war in Gaza going on at the same time?
I think I couldn't agree more with Hala. I think it's the world has lost interest in Sudan even before the Gaza war and the conflict in Ukraine. It started with the Russian-Ukrainian war. There's been much of an interest in the Ukraine in terms of the U.S. diplomacy and the EU and other institutions and the UN as well. I mean, when it came to Sudan, people were like, let us now deal with it differently. It hasn't been classified as a security issue, nor as a humanitarian issue. And one of the discussion about the humanitarian corridors, you cannot overlook the fact that these organizations left Sudan and left Khartoum the second week and the third week of the conflict, where in other areas they've been there. In Lebanon they've been there, and Palestine they're trying their best. In other places they're trying to to channel aid through the normal means. So I think if and the humanitarian corridors as well are not safe and are not protected, and without the organizations themselves, the international UN agencies working there to facilitate the flow of aid. So I think there's lack of interest by the international community. When there's lack of interest by specific actors within the international community that have been part of the process and the transition between 2019 to up to the moment where the conflict erupted in April 15th of 2023. So, but how can we change that? I think it's people, they cannot just ignore the fact that Sudan is a massive country. You need the stability in the Horn of Africa. You need to look at Sudan more seriously. you need to first of all look at the humanitarian aid and the flow without a political agreement, because you cannot also ensure humanitarian aid without a cessation of hostilities and ceasefire arrangements, which is basically a tough situation.
Yeah. Sebastien, as an aid organisation, it must be incredibly frustrating to see how great and vast the need is, but just not have the attention or resources to actually even begin to deal with it, really. I mean, how has the lack of international attention and the lack of donations actually affected the reality on the ground there for an organisation like yours?
Absolutely. And I think I would echo what Hala was saying also in terms of access, and how this has impacted basically the response in Sudan and the fact that we have 25 million people today in need. And Sudan has been completely off the charts, basically, in terms of interest. In terms of access, the first thing I would say, of course, the warring parties have their part of responsibility in impeding the response, the scale at which the response is needed. We have warring parties deliberately blocking aid in some areas, but we are facing as a humanitarian organization tremendous number of impediments in terms of accessing, administrative blockages, bureaucratic blockages, that is limiting our ability to reach the populations in need, right? But this is not the only thing. Even in areas where we do have access, we don't see international NGOs, and particularly the UN system, scaling up at a level needed and required to be able to deal with the emergency. We are still sometimes in kind of Sudan was a development context that has become an emergency context, and the transition from the development mindset to emergency mindset in many ways has not happened, especially for the UN system. In South Darfur, for example, it's an area that is hard to reach. It's hard to work there, but it's doable. And we have not seen for a year and a half, we have not seen the UN system return there to coordinate the response, bringing trucks, bringing supplies, and being able to respond in an adequate way. So we're really calling the UN system as well to take its part of responsibility in adequately dealing with this crisis, like it is doing in other contexts, for example. The responsibility is shared, and this is a common failure to the Sudanese people, and the cost of inaction is absolutely unbearable after 1 year and a half of conflict.
Yeah, and as we know that there have been multiple attempts at negotiations to try and get some sort of ceasefire deal. The latest round of talks in Switzerland basically failed even before they began, when the army didn't send any of its representatives. Hala, is there any point at this stage to even try and attempt a deal, or is that just simply too defeatist in the midst of what people are facing?
I don't think we should ever stop, trying to proceed with negotiations, because simply there is no other way out. But I think the lack of well-coordinated efforts has consistently been another challenge. There is multiple actors and a number of interests that's engaged on Sudan's questions. And I don't think until now there have been serious efforts, that looks at the interest of the multiple actors from a very high level, and extensive investments that will bring everyone together. But that has to be preceded with a lot of engagements with the multiple actors and agree, on a certain path. And as I said, this has not been happening. Sudan's efforts towards ceasefire and cessation of hostility has been constantly approached from a very ad hoc positions. More seriously, not taking, the situation on the ground into considerations, and not strategically planning it well, not exerting sufficient pressure, on the warring parties. Okay. And this is why they feel they can go on.
Abdelkhalig, I know that you're involved in discussions and plans about what Sudan could or should look like after the war. But, I mean, how difficult is that when it is still, we're really right in the midst of it? I mean, given that clearly there doesn't seem to be a clear path out of this at this point in time.
I think it's we have to have a forward looking for the conflict. I mean, the conflict will end one way or another, and most likely through negotiation. But then the question is, from which position are you negotiating to end the conflict? I think this is the key question. And that position then defines or pretty much dictate the post-conflict arrangements, or the political arrangements that would follow after the conflict. So, if hypothetically, if we would say that you need a ceasefire, and if the SAF managed successfully to regain control of Khartoum and then regain control of Al Jazeera state, that would change the position would turn the position upside down for the RSF. So then you need the international community and the regional actors as well to back a deal where a political agreement could be reached, and then you would talk about political arrangements. So the political arrangements would it be a transitional government? Would it be a government of national unity? We had similar different forms, but by the end of the day, you need some sort of an arrangement in some shape or form after the conflict. And this is by the part, I think it's a prerequisite to how you want to end the ceasefire, because you cannot look at the ceasefire and the humanitarian corridors without looking at what political agreement you would offer for the Sudanese armed forces and even the RSF to accept, and also for the regional actors as well to line behind and back.
Okay, Sebastien, we've only got a minute or so left. I mean, obviously the Sudanese people are desperate for this to end as soon as possible, but do they still have hope that it will?
Yes, we're hearing, but we're hearing some level of hope. But like for example, we just had to suspend our activities in the Zamzam camp recently because of the lack of supplies. And in this context, like people, are kind of like losing their hope after 1.5 years of conflict. And I would say that the perspective of peace for us, in our opinion, is like we need to be able to de-link our ability to respond to the crisis, to bring in humanitarian aid, to scale up the humanitarian response, regardless of whether peace and conflict resolution will happen in the next couple of months or years. So right now, the emergency for us is to be able to operate in the system and bring a bit more hope and dignity to the people that we assist.
I imagine that is something that is shared by everyone, not just in Sudan, but around the world, that they can try and bring an end to this conflict as quickly and painlessly as possible. Thank you so much, all three of you. We really do appreciate your time and your insight and thoughts on Inside Story today. Thank you. Well, thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Tom McRae, and the entire team, goodbye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.